Seeing none, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute to close.
Thank the chairman, and I thank the ranking member of the full committee and the ranking member of the subcommittee and the gentleman from Maryland for their remarks. I would agree that this is something that deserves further study, but as the gentlelady indicated, the ranking member of the full committee indicated, the recently finalized update to the WIC infant food packages does not contain any foods for the purpose of EI. So if the federal government is going to spend money on the WIC program, it would make sense to spend money on foods that will lower the rates of food allergy diagnoses down the line, along with healthcare spending. So I'd urge my colleagues to support the amendment, and I yield back.
Questions now on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no.
No.
The ayes have it. Amendment is agreed to. Franklin is recognized for the purpose of an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk and request unanimous consent to dispense.
Without objection, and the gentleman is recognized to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment will address a trade issue that has allowed certain foreign producers to skirt trade laws established by Congress. Specifically in this case, the amendment, we're referring to it as a molasses amendment, but it appears, and allegedly there are some Brazilian importers who are evading tariff rate quotas by shipping their goods to Canada and then having them enter northern ports of entry, specifically into Buffalo, under the guise of molasses. And it's a line item in the tariffs. The day is long, the night is late, and I've got a graph that will kind of demonstrate a little bit about what we're talking about here, but it's hard to see from across the room, but this shows the level of imports of molasses into the port of Buffalo going back to 2020 or so. If you go back to 2020, there's basically nothing on the graph at all. Nothing was coming in through Buffalo. Started to trickle up around 2021, 2022, and then suddenly has exploded in 2022, 2023. What's happening here is these sugar producers in Brazil have figured out that if they can convert their raw sugar cane to this form of molasses, supposedly molasses, bring it under that tariff line, it's taxed at a tariff that's extremely low, almost negligible. In fact, if you look on the far right side there where we've seen the spike, the entire tariff on that amount of molasses would be about $270,000. The reason that's important is had that come into the country as raw sugar cane and treated and tariffed that way, it would have produced a tariff of about $15 million. Converting that into the raw sugar cane that our U.S. producers are having to abide by, that'd be about $40 million worth of sugar cane. So it's placing our producers at a significant disadvantage. The concern we have here is not only is it spiking, it's continuing to increase. This specific company in Canada is now requesting of the USDA to start importing into Chicago. They found a loophole here. They're going to continue to exploit it, and if we don't stop it here, it's going to continue. I've got plenty of backup detail to go along with that, but there's a reason we have these tariff laws in place, and it's to protect our producers and growers. And if we don't do it here, it's going to be coming to another commodity near you. But with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Mr. Bishop to respond to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is a serious concern that product being imported into the United States under the tariff line specifically reserved for molasses is not actually molasses, but it's being doctored up to meet limited testing at our ports of entry. This amendment simply provides the ports of entry some help from molasses experts at the Agricultural Market Service to ensure that what's coming into the United States as molasses is actually molasses. So these are boots on the ground at AMS. They have the expertise to test and to make certain that what is coming in under the tariff lines is, in fact, what it's supposed to be. They can then share their findings, AMS can, with sister agencies that are responsible for enforcement. This is not a sugar issue. It's an enforce our laws issue. Every member of Congress who represents manufacturers, farmers, ranchers, workers, people who produce products in the United States, we want to ensure that the product that's imported into the country under the terms of our trade laws is actually the product that is entitled to come into the country that way. This is a common sense amendment. We don't want to support cheating, so we want to give our ports of entry some expert boots on the ground to make sure that what is coming in is what it's supposed to be. I support the amendment. I urge my colleagues to support it. It's a good amendment, and I think we should pass it.
Dr. Harris is recognized to address the amendment.
Thank you very much. Regardless of your position on the sugar program, these policies are usually determined in the Farm Bill, but the Agriculture Committee is all right with this, so I support the amendment. Yield back.
Gentlelady from Minnesota, Ms. McCollum, is recognized to address the amendment.
Thank you, and I thank Mr. Franklin for bringing forward this amendment. And you heard about sugar cane, and I'll stand with the sugar beet farmers. You know, cheating's cheating, and that's clearly what this company is doing. And if we don't stand up, especially working with our Canadian neighbors to the north, and I'm from Minnesota, about doing the right thing here, we're going to see other producers suffer here in the United States with people looking for loopholes. So support the amendment, and I'm yielding back over 4 minutes.
Gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Capter, is recognized to address the amendment.
Thank you. I rise in support of the amendment. I thank the gentleman for offering it. Just to put this on the record, in Ohio, we try to help our honey producers. And if you go to the store and try to buy honey now, there's probably 9 chances out of 10 it's adulterated. It's not really honey. It's got sugar water in it and everything else from China. So we've had problems, and I'm seeing John Molinar sitting there, and some people said, hey, they probably adulterated it in Michigan. And I don't know if that's true or not, but it's closer to the Canadian border. I don't know. But I just wanted to say it isn't only in molasses. And whether it's just in this sweetener sector or something, I don't know. But thank you for identifying the problem, because we have to label everything so carefully now. And also thank you for bringing it up. And obviously I support it too. Thank you.
I would just ask the gentlelady, did that remark come during football season by chance?
All the time.
Given the ferocity of that rivalry. Do any other members wish to address the amendment? If not, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the chairman and ranking member and my colleagues' support for this. I just urge everyone's support. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The question is now on the amendment offered by Mr. Franklin. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Okay. Ms. Lee of California is recognized for the purpose of an amendment. I'd ask the committee to give Ms. Lee your attention for her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk. It's Lee number 1.
The
That's
gentlelady.
for unanimous consent to dispense with the reading.
Without objection, the gentlelady is recognized to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. This amendment would restore funding to the Food for Peace program to the level requested by the administration. Now, I plan to withdraw this amendment after discussion, but I think it's important to flag how outrageous the Republican bill's 40% cut to global food aid is and how damaging it will be, damaging for hungry people, damaging for American farmers, and damaging for United States national interests. Food for Peace is one of the most important tools the United States has to respond to hunger around the world. It's been around since the 1950s when President Eisenhower first championed it as an important component of American foreign policy. I believe President Eisenhower was a Republican. But America's tradition of assisting people in need around the world is almost as old as the Republic. In 1812, Congress authorized President Madison to use federal funds to purchase food to help earthquake victims in Venezuela. American generosity is a huge part of this. But it's also clearly in the United States' national interest. Hungry people are desperate people. They are more likely to turn to leaders who promote violence or who seek to protect their children by traveling across borders in search of relief. Right now, 750 million people, almost 1 out of every 8 people worldwide, face hunger either chronically or seasonally. More than 36 billion people right now desperately need emergency aid to save them from starvation. For example, in and around Sudan right now, we are seeing a colossal food crisis. I was there on the Sudanese border probably about 2 months ago in Chad, and I witnessed desperate, hungry people. And of course, the World Food Program, then they were running out of food. Over 25 million people inside Sudan are starving. And as they flee to neighboring countries like Chad, they are putting strain on local resources. We know what needs to be done. We need to start pre-positioning food now, before the rainy season limits access. But relief agencies face a massive budget shortfall that prevents them from doing that at as needed scale. As a consequence, the response is going to cost more and help fewer people than it should. As the richest and most powerful country in the world, people are rightly asking what America is doing about this and other hunger crises. America often asks people in other countries to bend our national interests, but when they face one of the most urgent threats at their own existence, hunger, they are asking whether the United States will have their back. When we don't, they're forced to look elsewhere, sometimes to America's adversaries. I just returned from a bipartisan congressional delegation to Africa, a place where strategic competition, quite frankly, and you know this, it's real. In every country I visited in Africa, and this was a bipartisan delegation, we were told that governments want to partner with the United States, but that we are often missing in action. We simply don't show up when a country is in need. Based on the needs of hungry people around the world, the president has requested $1.8 billion for Food for Peace in fiscal 25. This bill provides only a little more than half of that amount, more than $600 million less than Congress provided last year. This will force the humanitarian organizations working to help people in need to drastically curtail their efforts while the need increases. People will die. Yes, people will die as a consequence. And many of these people will be children, including infants. And many of you have witnessed this in refugee camps and on the border of warring countries over and over and over again. And that's why a broad spectrum of outside groups is condemning this assault on Food for Peace. And it's not just humanitarian organizations. Growers, millers, shippers, longshoremen are all a part of the American tradition of generosity in the face of hunger that this bill would undermine. And Mr. Chairman, I have a letter from organizations that would like for me to make the committee aware of this letter. And I know we don't put documents into the record, but I would hope you would read this letter.
Certainly will.
And I ask members for their support.
Thank the gentlelady. Dr. Harris is recognized to respond to the amendment.
Thank you very much. Look, I rise in opposition to this amendment. Our bill provides $1 billion for the Food for Peace program. And I understand the Food for Peace program might have started in the Eisenhower administration. At the midpoint of the Eisenhower administration, 1956, the federal deficit was $1.7 billion. It's now over $1.7 trillion. This is not monopoly money. We either have to ask hard-earned American taxpayers to expand the Food for Peace program, because make no mistake about it, when you combine the $1 billion we provide with the $1 billion that the Secretary through the Commodity Credit Corporation provided, with the $300 million that's still in the fund, it's way more than last year's enacted level. So what we're asking the American taxpayer to do at a time when we have $2 trillion deficits, and remember, as I said in my opening comments, the Congressional Budget Office now projects that under the Biden administration spending plans, in the next 10 years, our deficits will grow, our debt will grow $22 trillion. At some point, we have to say enough is enough. $2.3 trillion for a food for peace type program is enough. That would be a record spending level. The president wanted even more. This president wants more for everything. He's claiming he lowered the deficit. Oh my gosh, it's $2 trillion. And what we have an amendment in front of us that would increase our debt and our deficit by another $800 million. If we ask the average American, do we want that $800 million to go helping them with their food bill because of food inflation under the Biden administration, or do we want to send it overseas? I guarantee you the overwhelming majority of Americans want this committee to do the right thing, to be a good steward of taxpayer dollars, because every dollar, every one of those $800 million comes from our hard-earned taxpayers' money, or we borrow it. Now, if we're willing to sell it to other countries, I'm fine. If this said we'll just make another $800 million, we'll loan it to another, but it's not. This is $800 million giveaway. Again, remember, $1 billion what we put in the bill, plus $1 billion the Secretary put in from Commodity Credit Corp, plus $300 million remaining in the fund is $2.3 billion. Last year, we enacted $1.6. Only in Washington is a $700 million increase in the amount you're going to do next fiscal year considered a cut. And the American people are tired of it. They're tired of the runaway spending that's resulted in huge inflation, driven up their food prices. And ladies and gentlemen, when we take this and we send it out, all we're doing, we're driving up food prices. That's what we're doing for Americans. They've had enough of it. We were very reasonable in this budget. We could have cut it. We could have cut food for peace even more because of the Commodity Credit Corporation spending again, the unauthorized spending by the Secretary. Now, the Farm Bill includes provisions that wouldn't allow the Secretary to do that anymore. That's the right thing to do, because the Food for Peace appropriations should come out of this committee, not out of USDA headquarters. So that's the way the Constitution was written. We have the ability to appropriate dollars. The Secretary's abused the ability, and now when we attempt to control some of that spending, we're accused of slashing funds to starving people overseas. Only in Washington. I yield back.
Mr. Bishop is recognized to address the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the gentlelady's amendment. Today is the 70th anniversary of the Food for Peace program. It's a slap in the face that on today, the 70th anniversary, the majority would celebrate by cutting the program by 40% to its lowest level in 20 years. This is unprecedented. Food for Peace is an essential component of U.S. foreign policy, provides global food security, and it strengthens U.S. leadership worldwide. The House bill would underfund Food for Peace by $800 million in the middle of a global hunger crisis. At a time when the world is facing a hunger crisis, why would we cut funding to a program that feeds the most vulnerable, the most food insecure women and children in the world? I believe in Matthew 25 and the mandate to feed the least of these. The bill before us today turns the backs of Congress and America on our global neighbors. Scripture admonishes us to love our neighbor as ourselves. We love ourselves when we support our farmers and their bounty by purchasing their bounty and making it available for those in need, our neighbors overseas. We love our neighbors when we share that bounty that our farmers produced. We produce much more in this country than we consume. Anyone with whom we can share God's love is our neighbor. Scriptures tell us that from those to whom much is given, much is required. In America, we are blessed with an abundance when it comes to food production. I believe our country's Judeo-Christian values dictate that we share our bounty with our foreign neighbors. Now, let me just say that while some may point to the recent Credit Commodity Corporation, the CCC funding, as an excuse to cut the program, this one-time funding does not function in the same manner with the same authorities as the Food for Peace program. The CCC funding to meet the emergency need around the world this year should not be used as an excuse to cut the base annual funding for this vital program. I urge my colleagues to join the gentlelady from California, to join people of goodwill, to join people who share our Judeo-Christian values, people who believe that we should do for the least of these, that we should be a good neighbor in the global neighborhood. I urge my colleagues to join us in supporting adequate funding for Food for Peace, for American farmers, for American values, and for those in need around the world. I urge you to support this amendment. It is good for humankind. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentlelady from Connecticut is recognized to address the amendment.
Thank you. I too rise in support of Representative Lee's amendment. 70 years ago, the recognition at that time was that both political parties knew that America had a moral obligation, compelling national interest, making sure that people around the world did not needlessly suffer from hunger, which we know inevitably leads to instability and conflict. If you look at history, you can just go right back to the French Revolution. It was about the loss of bread, not having enough bread, et cetera, and the people revolted. Food for Peace represents the best of our nation's generosity, highlights our global commitment to eradicate hunger. It reached over 50 million people in 2022. Emergency food aid and assistance helps small farmers feed themselves. It's life-saving, prevents starvation, and we're listening to the World Food Program today, and Ambassador Cindy McCain telling us that people are starving all over the world, in Somalia and Haiti and in Gaza, and that we need to be, that the United States needs to be front and center in this area. Our leadership, without Food for Peace and American leadership, the global effort to fight hunger is severely weakened. The most vulnerable around the world suffer. The gap will either not be filled or filled by America's adversaries, who have much more transactional approach to providing health. It's a good investment. Studies show that for every dollar invested in efforts to strengthen communities' resilience, save $7 in more expensive humanitarian aid down the line. It's worrisome about who we are as Americans when we're happy to send our weapons around the world, but cannot be bothered to send food. It's the right thing to do for children around the world. And the world, I believe, is watching us today. They will see how we act and what values we support. Support the amendment, and with that, yield back.
Thank you very much. Gentlelady from New York, Ms. Mings, recognized to address the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in strong support of Ranking Member Lee's amendment, which would increase funding for the Food for Peace Title II program to $1.8 billion, the amount requested in President Biden's fiscal year 2025 budget. Despite agreeing to top-line funding levels just a few months ago, our colleagues on the other side are trying to advance massive cuts that threaten women's health, attack the health of our climate, and undermine our national security. We saw this just a few weeks ago with an 11% cut to our diplomacy and development programs in the SFOP's full committee markup. Today, now, my Republican colleagues are proposing a 38% cut to the Food for Peace Title II program. This program helps feed people who are fleeing genocide and famine, who are disproportionately women and children. It helps provide meals to kids in conflict zones who are just trying to go to school to learn. So why cut it? Maybe the GOP is already taking a page from the Project 2025 playbook, which calls U.S. foreign aid a massive and open-ended global entitlement program. But I couldn't disagree more with that approach. Programs that address the underlying causes of malnutrition and hunger are important. As the world confronts conflicts in Ukraine, Sudan, Ethiopia, and the Middle East, we should be strengthening this life-saving and peace-building program, not cutting it. For this reason, I urge my colleagues to support Representative Lee's amendment. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady from California, Ms. Torres, is recognized for the purpose of addressing the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I too rise in support of Congresswoman Lee's amendment to restore funding to the Food for Peace program. Food for Peace is a very successful program that helps American farmers and it saves lives. I've had an opportunity, like some of you in this room, to travel into Sudan, South Sudan, Sierra Leone, been in the bush, been also in the Amazon, and seen way too many hungry babies, starving babies. I'm heartbroken, but about what I saw in Sudan. Children so tiny because they've been starving. And that was before the war broke. So imagine what they are feeling now and what they are suffering now. More than 10 million people are displaced internally, and over half the population, 26 million people, are facing food crisis, near famine, or famine in Sudan. In South Sudan, 7 out of 10 kids under 5 years old are malnourished. These children who need our help, they need our help today. And I urge all my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you. Are there other members wishing to address the amendment? Seeing none, the gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the members for speaking in support of this amendment. Let me first say I disagree with the chairman's assessment that the American people are tired of supporting these efforts to feed hungry children abroad. They'd be shocked that we're talking about a 40% cut this year. And yes, our food budget, Food for Peace, has increased. Population growth is real, and we don't even support family planning or birth control. And so, come on. This is really disingenuous in terms of arguing that the American people are tired of this. People of faith and people with no faith are concerned about hungry people throughout the world. Also, it's a crucial component of our foreign policy that advances United States national interests. This is one effective way of countering, as you all continue to rail on, the PRC's influence throughout the world. Also, let me be clear that this one-time emergency fund from the Commodity Credit Corporation, of course, that's welcome, but that's no substitute for adequately resourcing the Food for Peace program. And any talk about unobligated balances betrays an ignorance about how humanitarian funding works in practice. Also, I might point out that the majority continues to be penny-wise and pound-foolish. This is another terrible approach to federal funding. More kids are going to starve as a result. Thank you again.
Thank you. The questions now. The amendment has been withdrawn. I believe the gentlelady has another amendment. So the gentlelady is recognized from California. Ms. Lee is recognized for purposes of amendment.
And ask for the clerk to dispense of the reading.
Without objection, the gentlelady is recognized to explain her amendment.
Okay, Mr. Chairman and members, this amendment would strike certain sections of the underlying bill that blocks funding, once again, for diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility across the agencies that are funded by this bill. Section 755, it attempts to remove all efforts, and I quote, relating to further advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government, impacting the USDA, the FDA, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, and the Farm Credit Administration. Section 744 is yet another attempt to ban the teaching of our nation's racial history and diversity. Equity is not an add-on or an extra. It's central to the mission of USDA and FDA. The underlying bill would force any type of equity work to cease at USDA and hamstring their ability to fix their history of discrimination. Once again, Project 2025, if you look at that, it mirrors this unfortunate bill. The truth is, the anti-equity language in the Republican bill, it's an immoral attack on ranchers and farmers, including veterans, specialty crop farmers, women, farmers of color, rural and low-income communities. Furthermore, at a time when the LGBTQ plus community is under attack, displaying a pride flag is an important signal to the LGBTQ plus I community that people belong, that they're valued, that they're respected. These writers make it clear that Republicans don't believe that people should belong, quote, the other, or should be affirmed. In fact, House Republicans held more than, I think it was about 50 anti-LGBTQI votes on the House floor last year. Now you're trying to restrict the ability of federal agencies to show their support for the LGBTQ plus employees and create a license to discriminate against same-sex marriage. Our nation's farmers and ranchers and families living in rural communities reflect the complete reality of America, and they deserve better. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment to strike these writers from the bill, and I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Harris is recognized to address the amendment.
Thank you. I'll be brief at this hour. Look, I rise in opposition to the amendment. Like other bills passed by this committee, the agriculture bill includes provisions to stop the Biden executive orders on DEI and CRT, prohibit flying of unofficial flags, which really have no business flying over U.S. government buildings, and includes protections for the belief in natural marriage. And that's a religious protection, and I would hope that everyone would support religious freedom and conscience protection. These policies represent conservative values, should not be struck from the bill. I urge my colleagues to vote against the amendment and yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Bishop is recognized to address the amendment.
I'm sorry. I rise in support of the gentlelady's amendment. I think it's well taken. I think that we know the arguments in favor of it. It's the right thing to do, and I think the gentlelady is on the right track in trying to steer this committee and steer our Congress back into a position of diversity, inclusion, and a country that is acceptable to everyone, and a country that is tolerant of everyone. And so with that, I support the gentlelady's amendment. I urge support.
Thank you. Do any other members wish to address the amendment? If not, the gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Protecting all of our nation's farmers and ranchers and families living in rural communities is essential. It's time that congressional Republicans step away from this Project 2025 playbook and stop dragging us down a path of chaos and division, and that's what this does. So I urge my colleagues to support my amendment and ensure that diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility remain a priority within the federal government, and that all people are treated equally and with respect, with dignity, and are seen and are heard and are treated as they should be treated as human beings. Thank you, and I yield the balance of my time, and I urge an aye vote.
The question is now on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from California. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Roll call vote has been requested. There's a sufficient show of hands. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, aye. Mr. Amadei. Mrs. Bice. Mrs. Bice, no. Mr. Bishop. Yes. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carl. Mr. Carl, no. Mr. Carter. Mr. Cartwright. Aye. Mr. Cartwright, aye. Mr. Case. Mr. Case, aye. Mr. Siscomani. Mr. Siscomani. Mr. Siscomani, no. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, no. Mr. Cloud. Mr. Clyde. Negative. Mr. Clyde, no. Mr. Cole.
No.
Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Ms. DeLauro. Aye. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart. No. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Edwards. No. Mr. Edwards, no. Mr. Elzey. No. Mr. Elzey, no. Mr. Espaillat. Mr. Espaillat, aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, no. Ms. Frankel. Ms. Frankel, aye. Mr. Franklin. Mr. Franklin, no. Mr. Garcia. Mr. Garcia, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Ms. Granger. Mr. Guest. No. Mr. Guest, no. Mr. Harder. Dr. Harris. No. Dr. Harris, no. Mrs. Hinson. Mrs. Hinson, no. Mr. Hoyer. No. Mr. Hoyer, no. Mr. Joyce.
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
Mr. Hoyer, aye. Mr. Joyce. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kilmer. Aye. Mr. Kilmer, aye. Mr. LaTurner. Ms. Lee of California. Aye. Ms. Lee of California, aye. Ms. Lee of Nevada. Ms. Lee of Nevada, aye. Ms. Letlow. Ms. Letlow, no. Ms. McCollum. Ms. McCollum, aye. Ms. Ming. Aye. Ms. Ming, aye. Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinar, no. Mr. Morelli. Aye. Mr. Morelli, aye. Mr. Newhouse. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, aye. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler. Mr. Reschenthaler, no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Ruppersberger. Mr. Ruppersberger, aye. Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Rutherford, no. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, no. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Trone. Aye. Mr. Trone, aye. Miss Underwood. Aye. Miss Underwood, aye. Mr. Valadeo. Miss Wasserman Schultz. Miss Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mrs. Watson Coleman. Mrs. Watson Coleman, aye. Miss Wexton. Miss Wexton, aye. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Zinke. Mr. Zinke, no.
Are there any members who have not voted or wish to change their vote?
Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Valadeo, no.
Are there other members wishing to vote or have their vote changed, or to change their vote? Seeing none, the clerks will tally. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Cloud, no.
On this vote, the ayes are 26, the noes are 29. The amendment is not adopted. Is there any further amendment or discussion? Mr. Ruppersberger is recognized for the purpose of an amendment.
Chair, I ask for unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
I rise today in support of my amendment to protect the many Americans victimized by SNAP's benefit. Theft of SNAP benefits is on the rise. Unfortunately, electronic benefit transfer card, and that's called EBT, skimming is very, very easy. While EBT cards look and function similar to ATM or credit card, they do not have the same security features. Criminals target benefit recipients' EBT cards by way of identity theft or card skimming. The victims, and this is important, including veterans, those on fixed incomes, and the millions of employees, SNAP participants, lose access to these critical funds intended to supplement their food budgets. To my colleagues across the aisle, I understand we may not always agree on whether or not SNAP program should be expanded or downsized, but I wanted to note that the victims of SNAP benefit theft and the beneficiaries of these reimbursement funds are law-abiding individuals under the current letter of the law. They have lost their benefits through no fault of their own. In fact, census data shows that in a typical month, over half of working-age non-disabled individuals participating in the SNAP program are working or were working in that same month, and most use the program as a short-term lifeline. Voting down this amendment means you are letting criminals continue to steal funds from our nation's most vulnerable individuals who do not absolutely nothing but to try to feed their family. Last year, as required by the Bipartisan Consolidated Appropriation Act of 2023, federal funds were appropriated to reimburse victims of this horrible crime to date. To date, this provision has provided reimbursement to over 120,000 households. In just 1 year, it changed to something feasible that is working. Unfortunately, that provision is set to expire this September. My amendment would simply strike this sunset and secure permanent reimbursement to any future victims of SNAP theft. The bottom line is this: we must do more to stop criminals from stealing Americans' hard-earned taxpayer dollars and protect our most vulnerable. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Harris is recognized to respond to the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I rise reluctantly in opposition to the amendment. The gentleman, my colleague from Maryland, is not correct. The problem is that they don't function like credit cards. And if you don't believe me, take the credit card out of your wallet. It has a chip on it. EBT cards don't have chips on them except in very few states that have begun to put it on. That's the problem. They don't function like the credit cards.
I agree.
So credit card companies figured out that when you have a fraud problem, the quickest way to get rid of it is put a chip on that card.
Well,
ladies and gentlemen,
sorry.
You'll get your minute to close. Ladies and gentlemen, the fact of the matter is that the credit card companies rapidly instituted chips when they saw this problem. Now, just to remind you of how the administration of SNAP works. Now, remember, it's 100% federal dollars to the benefit, unlike Medicaid where you have a cost share, it's 100%. So the state actually has an incentive to get as much money in as possible because there's no skin in the game. But we ask them to administer the program, and we actually pay 50% for those administrative costs. So a state realizing that this is occurring, and I spoke to the person in my state, Secretary of Human Resources, he said, yeah, we've known it's for years and it's accelerating. And you ask him, well, how come every SNAP person doesn't have a chip card? Because when my credit card company saw this happening, I got a chip card in the mail pretty quickly. And the reason is because the states don't have skin in the game. They want to come to the federal government year after year, and now with this amendment permanently, and have the federal taxpayer backstop what these administrators aren't doing in the states. That's just not right. And furthermore, this amendment's authorizing language. When the House Ag Committee marked up the Farm Bill, this provision was intentionally not included. They understand that this federal backstop has to stop, get those states to get those chip cards out. That's what they've got to do. Even though the CBO says the provision doesn't score, that's just the way the CBO bases, that's just the way they do their scoring. We're all frustrated by it. We know that if this provision passed, it would cost taxpayers $75 to $150 million a year to reimburse SNAP benefits, and that number would be increasing. Because again, the states are not taking the measures to put that chip on there. I'm sympathetic to households have their benefits stolen. Making this a permanent law provision where federal backstop is, in Maryland, what they did is our legislature actually put money in the budget to help pay, because they realized that it was their fault. They're supposed to administer this program. They put money in the budget to actually pay it. This amendment throws it back to the federal taxpayer. States don't pay, again, they don't pay one dime for SNAP benefits. It's 100% federal funds. There is no incentive for them to quickly move to chip technology. That's just the facts. And if we allow this to exist forever, there will never be an incentive for them to go to chip technology. Again, it's authorizing. It's opposed by the House Ag Committee, not included in the Farm Bill. Reality, this has already cost taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars for something the states should be doing more quickly. I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment.
Thank you. Mr. Bishop is recognized to address the amendment.
I rise in support of the gentleman's amendment. I think it's an excellent amendment, and I think that we in Congress, if we want to be responsible, as the chair suggests, we can create incentives for the states to put the chip on the card. The replacement of stolen benefits for beneficiaries is an issue that we should have bipartisan agreement on. We did it 2 years ago, and we got bipartisan agreement to put it into the FY23 omnibus. Here are the results of that. All 50 states and D.C., Guam, and the Virgin Islands got their specific state plans approved. 127,290 claims were approved. $62 million in stolen benefits were replaced. This amendment will simply extend the replacement of those benefits for another 2 years. Now, we can take the necessary action to require, as a condition, that the states put a chip on the cards. But I hope that we can all come together to help those in need who have been victimized and were harmed by scammers, and not take it out on them. I think it's a good amendment. I think we should pass it, and I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back.
Gentlelady from New York, Ms. Mings, recognized to address the amendment.
Chair, I rise in support of Representative Ruppersberger's amendment. We know that this is a real problem and it is on the rise. In fact, in this report, there is bipartisan language on working on efforts to improve technology and to be able to have a more secure card. But in the meantime, these benefits that have been stolen from vulnerable individuals and families and forcing them to possibly go hungry is unconscionable. These funds that were appropriated to reimburse victims last year were very necessary for them, but as was mentioned, it's going to expire at the end of September. Data shows that in fiscal years 23 and 24, over 36,000 New Yorkers were approved for claims of stolen SNAP benefits. That's over $17.5 million in benefits that were replaced. So these victims of SNAP benefit theft and the beneficiaries of these reimbursement funds are hardworking Americans. We can help them and restore them while at the same time working to improve technology, working with state and local agencies. They were victims of a crime through no fault of their own, and this affects their food security and literally the health and well-being of their families. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Thank you. Are there any other members who wish to address the amendment? If not, the gentleman from Maryland.
Before I start, Congressman Harris, I think you didn't hear me right when I said that theft of SNAP benefits is on the rise. Unfortunately, electronic benefit transfer card skimming is very easy. While EBT cards look and function similar to ATM or credit card, they do not have the same security features. And you misinterpreted me there to begin with. Now, what I want to say is to conclude, my amendment will allow for reimbursement of benefits to continue and protect law-abiding individuals who are struggling to put food on their tables. This is a serious and a pervasive problem that further warrants further discussion. Thank you, and with that, I would like to withdraw my amendment. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Amendment is withdrawn. Ms. Wasserman Schultz is recognized for the purpose of an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Okay, we can promote you tonight. It's been a long day. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that my amendment be considered as read.
You were my friend.
Yeah, right? I know. It's tough enough that you're the chair of the committee. Mr. Chairman, this bill, like the Labor H bill this morning that we marked up, I think that was this morning, again makes it very clear on where my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are. It doesn't appear they have any intention of curbing tobacco use or protecting children and minorities from being targeted and harmed by big tobacco, and they have no intention of allowing FDA to follow science and protect public health. This bill includes a new-ish rider, one drafted by big tobacco, clearly, and easily sold to the majority. It restricts the FDA's ability to finalize, issue, or implement rules on menthol cigarettes, flavored cigars, and a maximum cigarette nicotine level unless and until the FDA takes several long-term unrelated actions on other e-cigarette activities. For years, I've vocally shared my grave concerns about illegal e-cigarettes on the market, and I continue to press the FDA to use every tool it has to increase enforcement against these products. But this clever delay and distract tactic engineered by big tobacco is a wolf in sheep's clothing. And it's a pathetic backdoor method to delay or block FDA rules that would save countless lives. The e-cigarette provisions in this rider are cleverly designed barriers to delay FDA cigarette and cigar regulations and not a real effort to remove unauthorized e-cigarettes from the market. This rider, let's be clear, blocks three critical and long overdue FDA rules. One rule that it blocks would prohibit menthol cigarettes, which big tobacco aggressively markets to Black Americans and is responsible for dire health disparities and creates millions of new smokers and hundreds of thousands of premature deaths. The second rule that it blocks would prohibit flavored cigars. These products attract children as young as middle school, addicting them through appealing flavors that reduce the harsh taste of tobacco. And the third rule would reduce the nicotine levels in cigarettes to minimally addicted levels. Why would we not want to do that? It would prevent our youth from becoming addicted to cigarettes and help adult smokers quit. Why? Because big tobacco doesn't want us to. The FDA's ability to finalize these rules, which big tobacco has been working relentlessly to halt, should not be and cannot be conditioned in this manner. They are not mutually exclusive. FDA can and must address the plague of illegal e-cigarettes flooding the market, and they can walk and chew gum in the same time and move forward with finalizing its rule on combustible tobacco products. FDA has studied the dire health impacts of menthol cigarettes for over a decade, and in October sent its final rules on menthol cigarette and flavored cigars to OMB. These rules are science-based, and they'll reduce the number of kids who become addicted to tobacco, confront racial disparities, and ultimately save lives. Sadly, this rider shows that the majority is still beholden to big tobacco and its bottom line. This rider, once again, places these companies' malicious priorities over the health and well-being of children and minorities. This rider aids and abets big tobacco to predatorily target these vulnerable populations every single day. All of my colleagues here know now by now that I'm a cancer survivor, and there isn't a single person in this room that cancer hasn't touched in some painful way, and I shared some of that pain this morning. Yet this pro-cancer rider is the same shameful dance that we do every year where my colleagues on the other side of the aisle do big tobacco's deadly bidding. The sooner that the FDA can finalize and implement these rules, the sooner that we'll stop more kids from smoking or vaping, save more lives, and block big tobacco's lethally targeted marketing of these products. And lastly, for my colleagues who preach fiscal responsibility, let me remind you that tobacco use is responsible for about $241 billion in healthcare costs each year. And you're saddling taxpayers with that, since more than 60% of these costs are paid by Medicare and Medicaid. Perhaps one of you can explain why it's fine to soak taxpayers. Also, tobacco companies can sit atop fat stacks of deadly profits. Make no mistake, delays to these rules costs lives. And we should not be costing lives, we should be saving lives here. I yield back the balance of my time and urge my colleagues to adopt my amendment.
Thank you. Dr. Harris is recognized to address the amendment.
Thank you very much. I rise in opposition to the amendment. The amendment strikes language that requires FDA to focus on enforcement of illicit, unregulated, synthetic nicotine products that are flooding our market. The underlying language in the bill that is being struck simply asks FDA, or I should say requires the FDA, to go after the illicit products first, instead of new rulemakings on nicotine levels or menthol that candidly could have been finalized a year ago if the White House thought it was the right policy or the right politics. The delay is their decision. Removal of illicit products has been a long-standing bipartisan priority. Congress's intent was clear, with legislation requiring all synthetic products without authorization to be removed from the market. Pretty simple. You don't have authorization, FDA is supposed to remove it. The FDA has failed miserably in this. I recognize the language is not perfect, but in the end, I believe it's a positive step toward removing those certain illegal products, mostly originating in China, by the way. We can't afford the current loopholes that enable thousands of these illicit products to remain on the market, including ELF and Puff Bar. Let's keep the FDA focused first on the real products harming our children and increase the enforcement of illicit Chinese synthetic products. I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment.
Thank you. Mr. Bishop is recognized to address the amendment.
Thank you. I have no recommendation on the gentlelady's amendment.
Mr. Rutherford is recognized to address the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today in opposition to the gentlelady's amendment to strike a provision in this bill that restricts the implementation of the FDA's ill-advised flavored cigar and menthol cigarette rules until they properly regulate the illegal vapor products. As we know, limiting legal choices for adult consumers will lead to the growth of illicit markets, increased crime, and that burden will fall to state and local law enforcement agencies that are already stretched thin. At a time when the FDA is failing to regulate, as was mentioned earlier, the illegal vapor products, mostly from China, they should not be creating a new illicit market for banning currently legal flavored cigars and menthol cigarettes. We can all agree that we must work to keep tobacco products out of the hands of children. However, listen to this number. Tobacco usage rates among young adults are historically low, and they are continuing to decline. And in fact, the CDC's National Youth Tobacco Survey shows considerable decreases in high school age cigar use, actually falling from 14.8% in 2000 to less than 2% in 2023. So from 14.8% in 2000 to less than 2% in 2023. These numbers do not justify an across-the-board prohibition of legal flavored cigars and menthol cigarettes. The FDA needs to refocus and spend its time and resources on what Congress directed them to do, which is to properly regulate vapor products, especially those foreign products coming in from places like China, again, so that dangerous substances don't end up in the hands and the lungs of our children. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back, but I urge opposition to this amendment.
Thank you very much. The gentlelady from Connecticut, Ms. Delors, recognized to address the amendment.
I rise in support of this amendment. offered by several of my colleagues, which would reverse an unnecessary and dangerous rider that stalls the implementation of a comprehensive, well-written rule to end the sale of flavored menthol cigarettes and cigars. Again, it must remind us of the stakes of the smoking public health crisis. Each year, nearly 500,000 U.S. adults die prematurely due to smoking-related diseases, including exposure to secondhand smoke. Smoking harms nearly every organ of the body and compromises the immune system. Simply put, menthol cigarettes make it easier to start smoking and harder to quit. Big Tobacco knows this. That's why they are pushing flavors, including menthol, as products. They are one of the primary reasons kids start using tobacco products. Currently, nearly 19 million people smoke menthol cigarettes. That includes 3 million U.S. middle and high school students reportedly currently using a tobacco product, including e-cigarettes. That is nearly 10% of our middle and high school students using a highly addictive product on a regular basis. Research shows that ending the sale of menthol cigarettes could result in a significant number of people quitting smoking. In fact, the American Lung Association quotes a study that estimates almost 1 million people would quit smoking within 17 months of the end of the sale of menthol cigarettes. There is simply no good reason to put these rules, which have been over 2 years in the making and have been supported extensively during public comment sessions, on hold in order to demand changes to other rules related to foreign tobacco products. I believe we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We do not need to tie our hands on this issue to make progress on another. I'm not willing to halt the progress that we've made in taking these dangerous and addictive products off the market, not after we have proven that we can choose a better path forward. We have done it in the past, and I believe we must do so again. I urge my colleagues to support Ranking Member Wasserman Schultz's amendment, and I yield back.
Gentlelady from California, Ms. Lee, is recognized to address the amendment.
Thank the gentlelady from Florida for offering this amendment, which I am proud to co-lead with her as well as Representative Underwood. Our amendment would strike Section 733 of this underlying bill, and if enacted, this terrible toxic policy rider would embolden the tobacco industry to continue targeting youth, especially black and brown youth, and keep another generation of kids addicted to tobacco products. According to CDC, menthol in cigarettes can change how we experience taste and pain. Menthol creates a cooling sensation in the throat, thereby making tobacco smoke easier to inhale. It also enhances the effects of nicotine in the brain, making it more addictive and harder to quit. It's no surprise that Big Tobacco has targeted their marketing of menthol cigarettes toward African Americans and other minorities, and quite frankly, they've really been successful. Tobacco use in the black community is the leading cause of preventable death. I mentioned earlier my mother had COPD. I've talked to members, and many members here have family members who have died as a result of tobacco and pollution and all of the terrible things that have environmental and corporate influence which lead to death. Over 45,000 black men and women die from tobacco-related diseases every single year, and black Americans die from heart disease, lung cancer, stroke, and other tobacco-related diseases at rates far higher than other racial and ethnic groups. It's really a shame that this bill puts tobacco industry profits, and that's what it does, over public health. The industry-backed provisions in the underlying bill would prohibit the FDA from proceeding with rules to prohibit menthol cigarettes and flavored cigars. The rider would also prevent FDA from moving forward with the rule setting a maximum nicotine content for cigarettes. Wow, we're going backwards. The FDA's proposed rules would literally save millions of lives, including a disproportionate number of black lives, and black lives do matter. This rider is really a gift to the industry. allowing it to continue to target the Black community, and yet another generation of Americans will be addicted with these deadly products. We must do everything we can do to call out tobacco companies engaged in predatory behaviors and specifically marketing menthol cigarettes to youth. The sooner the FDA's new rules are finalized and implemented, the sooner we can prevent more kids from smoking, we can save lives, and stop the tobacco industry's lethal targeted marketing of these products, and that is what's taking place. Make no mistake, by erecting barriers to issuing important FDA rules, Section 733 of this bill will cost lives. I want to thank the gentlelady from Florida for once again staying very consistent and focused on her efforts to make sure that lives are saved. So thank you again, and I yield back and urge an I vote on this amendment.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Underwood, is recognized to address the amendment.
Chairman, I strongly support this amendment, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. Despite all the efforts we've made to reduce smoking rates in recent decades, cigarette smoking is still the leading cause of preventable disease, disability, and death, yes, death, in the United States. Every day, approximately 1,600 young people try their first cigarette, and over 80% of those children pick flavored products. For many of them, this is a life-altering choice. Each day that passes without meaningful action, we lose more kids to addiction and more Americans to preventable death. We know how this public health crisis started, and we know how we can work to end it. The FDA's proposed rule on menthol tobacco products would save lives, and yet the Republican bill we are considering today would block the FDA from advancing it. Supporting this amendment will allow the FDA to do its job and protect more kids from getting addicted to tobacco. We know that banning flavored products will decrease smoking among youth because we've already seen it. The 2009 ban on flavored cigarettes was associated with significant declines in smoking. Menthol products have had devastating effects on public health, especially among communities of color. Today, nearly 90% of all Black smokers use menthol cigarettes, and more than 39,000 Black Americans die from tobacco-related cancer every year. Every day that these products remain on the market, we are putting America's youth at risk of addiction and further harming communities that have already suffered their impact. Today, right now, we have the opportunity to move forward with evidence-based policies that will protect kids and save millions of lives. Don't we want to do that, colleagues? We've stayed here this whole time. Let's do something great together. I believe in us. I really do. I thank Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz for offering the amendment and for her longtime leadership on this issue. I urge all my colleagues to consider supporting this amendment and to protect our youth and communities. We are counting on you, colleagues, in this moment. I yield back.
Are there other members wishing to address the amendment? Seeing none, the gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank Congresswoman Lee and Congresswoman Underwood for joining me in co-leading this important amendment. I just can't really imagine why anyone would believe that we should halt important rules like this, particularly the rule which I assume that the chairman of the subcommittee was referring to when he said it's not perfect language, would want to halt limiting the amount of nicotine in a tobacco product so that you could make it less likely that someone gets addicted. The only reason not to do that is to put more money in big tobacco's products. I mean, we can't allow big tobacco to keep targeting the Black community and addict yet another generation of young Americans to its deadly products. To anyone prepared to vote against my amendment, think about the cost and the weight of your decision-making and where your priorities lie. I urge my colleagues to oppose this rider and vote yes on our amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Question is now on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Florida. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Roll call has been requested. Show of hands is sufficient. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, aye. Mr. Amadei. Mrs. Bice. Mrs. Bice, no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carl. Mr. Carl, no. Mr. Carter. Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Cartwright, aye. Mr. Case. Mr. Case, aye. Mr. Siscomani. Mr. Siscomani, no. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, no. Mr. Cloud. Mr. Clyde. Mr. Clyde, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, no. Ms. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Elzey. Mr. Elzey, no. Mr. Espaillat. Mr. Espaillat, aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, no. Ms. Frankel. Ms. Frankel, aye. Mr. Franklin. Mr. Franklin, no. Mr. Garcia. Mr. Garcia, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Ms. Granger. Mr. Guest. Mr. Guest, no. Mr. Harder. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, no. Mrs. Hinson. Mrs. Hinson, no. Mr. Hoyer. Mr. Hoyer, aye. Mr. Joyce. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer, aye. Mr. LaTurner. Ms. Lee of California. Ms. Lee of California, aye. Ms. Lee of Nevada. Ms. Lee of Nevada, aye. Ms. Letlow. Ms. Letlow, no. Ms. McCollum. Ms. McCollum, aye. Ms. Ming. Ms. Ming, aye. Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinar, no. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli, aye. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, no. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, aye. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler. Mr. Reschenthaler, no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Ruppersberger. Mr. Ruppersberger, aye. Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Rutherford, no. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, no. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Trone. Mr. Trone, aye. Miss Underwood. Miss Underwood, aye. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, no. Miss Wasserman Schultz. Miss Wasserman Schultz, aye. Miss Watson Coleman. Mrs. Watson Coleman, aye. Miss Wexton. Miss Wexton, aye. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Zinke. Mr. Zinke, no.
Are there any members wishing to vote or change their vote?
Mr. Edwards, no.
Gentleman from Texas?
Mr. Cloud, no.
Clerk will tally. On this vote, the ayes are 24, the noes are 31. The amendment is not adopted. Is there any further amendment or discussion? Are there any other amendments?
Mr. Chairman?
Where? Mr. Pocan.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a standalone amendment at the desk, and I would ask unanimous consent that it be considered read.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to apologize for the confusion. You have two amendments in front of you. One was an amendment to Mr. Klein's, and the only reason we had that is we've had this amendment prepared, and we had heard there may be a secondary amendment on a completely unrelated subject, something I know we don't do on this committee. But since it was happening, we wanted to have a debate on our amendment.
So we looked at the first Republican amendment so we could try to have that, and it was the wrong thing to do. I don't want to be that guy. So, Mr. Klein, I just want you to know that's why, sorry it was here, but we had no intention of taking the committee to a new low. So just want to make sure everyone understands the confusion that could be out there. So this is an amendment. You know, I know we spent a lot of time last year and this year talking about pride flags. And, you know, out of the enormity of our budget, to have so much debate about a piece of cloth does seem a little bit silly to folks. But for many people, myself included, it actually means something. You know, for years and decades of discrimination for many people, it's a symbol that is sort of a symbol of freedom. And it may not mean much to you, but to people who it does mean something to, it does mean something to. But somehow last year, it became controversial. We talked about flying it over the Department of Ag, and you know, we talked about gay garbanzo beans and all this other stuff. And it was a rather ridiculous debate that unfortunately has continued in every single one of the 12 bills we have. But if you really care about flags, you really care about the symbolism of a flag, there is something that we could do. And that's why we thought appropriate on this bill, since this is where all the debate was last year, is on the idea that we would have a flag flown upside down. As we all know, it's incredibly disrespectful on multiple fronts. According to the United States Flag Code, it says, quote, "The flag should never be displayed with the union down, except as a symbol of dire distress in instances of extreme danger to life or property." The VA guideline says, out of respect for the U.S. flag, never display it with the union down except as a signal of distress. The VFW, every year we get our VFW folks who come in. I love my VFW folks come into the office. They have in their documents, do not fly flag upside down unless there is an emergency. The American Legion was quoted in an article in the New York Times saying the American flag is a symbol of courage, strength, freedom, and democracy. American Legion members swore their lives to protect all that that flag stands for. Our organization has also led to the creation of the U.S. Flag Code, which includes the following: the flag should never be displayed with the union down except as a signal of dire distress in instances of extreme danger to life or property. If you really think about flags as much as you do, because all 12 appropriation bills talk about flags, which I never would have put on my bingo card when I came to Congress, this is something you could actually support, which is to make sure that we're respecting the flag of this country and following the VFW and the American Legion and the VA and the United States Flag Code. So it is actually very related. I don't know if there'll be an amendment about mental competency, which I believe was a completely unrelated amendment that would take this process down, I think, a very negative road. But I do think, as every other member, you can put an amendment up and get a vote, and that's why I put this up there. I hope that we won't denigrate this committee to a new low. But if that happens, it happens. But again, I mean, Mr. Klein, I just want to apologize to you that it was on here. You were the first one on the list. We wrote it. We thought we'd get our independent thing, and we said, no, we're not going there. We don't want to take this committee to that place. No one should take this committee to that place. We all need to respect this committee, that you would not go there. So I'm not going there, but I do have an amendment that's real. If you really care about flags, if you really care about the symbolism of flags, this amendment addresses that. So, Mr. Chair, I hope that we will vote for this amendment. I think it is a common sense amendment. Let's stick with the VFW, and I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Harris is recognized to address the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have a second degree amendment at the desk and ask that the unanimous consent that the reading be waived.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
We've gone to the new low, so while we're there, the gentleman might believe that we don't know what this is all about. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't, I don't know. This is about a Supreme Court justice whose wife flew a flag upside down. That's what it is. So if we're going to discuss Supreme Court justices, let's talk about the executive branch. What my second-degree amendment says, and I'll read it, says not later than 30 days after the date of enactment of the, by the way, so what the amendment does, the original amendment, it says that the Secretary of the Department of Agriculture, the Commissioner of the FDA, the Chair of the CFTC, they can't fly an upside-down flag at their facility. But what's more important is that not later after 30 days after the date of enactment of this act, each official identified in that amendment shall self-certify that the official has undergone a cognitive assessment that found no deficits and submit such certification to the United States Office of Personnel Management. Now, why is this so important? Well, because remember, some of these officials are put in at the beginning of administration, and over the course of 4 years, they might develop a problem, a cognitive problem that interferes with their ability to do the job. Now, the CFTC is pretty important. I don't understand all the things about derivatives and commodities but the chairman better understand, because we have foreign enemies that are willing to use our derivative system and our commodities trading system to subvert the United States system. Remember, our agriculture community depends on it. I want to know that our chairman of that CFTC has the cognitive ability to do the job. Secretary of Agriculture makes some pretty important decisions regarding my district. I want to know that he knows what he's doing, that he has cognitive ability. I personally think all the leaders in the executive branch probably ought to do this, but I'm restricting my secondary amendment to the same individuals that the maker of the amendment restricted it to. What about the FDA commissioner? He's a pretty smart guy. But if he loses some of those cognitive abilities, through natural reasons, people age, they do things happen. We have to make sure he has the cognitive ability to make the important decisions that the commissioner, under law, is supposed to be making. Now, he could collect a group of people around him to make those decisions if that should happen. But that really wouldn't be proper, would it? Because the Senate, when they voted to confirm those individuals, they didn't vote for a whole bunch of other people who surround that individual. They voted to confirm that individual. So this amendment makes a lot of sense, because I read the newspapers every day. Americans wonder whether our executive branch is held to that standard. And we ought to. So if the gentleman wants to have a flag standard, well and good, let's do it. I didn't strike his language. I just said, while we're requiring those officials not to fly that flag upside down, let's actually ask them to certify that they have had a cognitive test that shows that they have the ability to lead those organizations. And so I urge rejection, I urge adoption of this amendment. And if this secondary amendment is not adopted, I urge rejection of the underlying amendment. I yield back.
Do any other members seek recognition to speak on the second-degree amendment? Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wonder if the gentleman who's in charge of the subcommittee would yield to a question. You didn't specify whether or not you'd support the underlying amendment if this was added. Oh, you're playing coy. Okay. My apologies to the committee. I really didn't think we were going to go to this place, but clearly we're going to this place. I'm not going to debate it. Vote for it, vote against it. It's ridiculous, right? Period. I think we all understand that. So whatever, it really doesn't matter. It would have been nice if there could have been a yielding, so at least we could have understood where they wanted to go.
Point of order? Is the gentleman's secondary amendment, Mr. Chairman, germane to the gentleman's underlying amendment? Because I'm not sure what cognitive testing has to do with whether flags are flown upside down. We do have germanity rules.
We actually don't have an enforceable point of order in this forum. I'm advised by the parliamentarian.
So anyone can introduce anything they want. It doesn't matter. We have no rules.
I think that's probably a correct interpretation. We simply don't have a set of rules that has an enforceable point of order.
Okay, well, we probably need to correct that in the future going forward, even though that's probably 200-something years of appropriations history. But this is ridiculous.
So anybody, other members that wish to address
I
the
think,
secondary amendment?
sorry, I was still standing. She just did a point of
Where?
order.
Who? Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Pocan.
Yeah, no worries.
I thought you.
And look,
I
it's not worthy of debate, so don't worry, I'm not going long.
Gentleman is recognized.
What I didn't want to see happen, but it did, is we've decided to take this committee a step closer to oversight and government reform. No eyelashes, no bleach blonde bodies, but we went in our own way there, and it's just a sad way to end this process. I yield back.
Do any other amendments seek to address secondary point of order? Okay, if there are not, Dr. Harris is recognized for 1 minute to close.
Thank you very much. The ability of an executive to carry out their job, in this case, I'll repeat it, executives confirmed by the Senate, not their staff, not their advisors, not somebody, some unknown person existing in that executive office. That's an important idea. I think we ought to do it. I think, again, we ought to consider this for a wider range of executives, but again, this is only considering the executives mentioned in the underlying amendment. I think it's a timely topic, to be honest with you. I think we should take a position on this as Congress. Our ability is to do it in this committee. Whether or not cognitive testing of high-level executives in the United States government is a good idea or not. I yield back.
I think I may have inadvertently, Mr. Cloud, did you want to be recognized? Okay. All right. Questions now on the second-degree amendment offered by Dr. Harris. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the second-degree amendment is adopted. Okay. We now return to the amendment offered by Mr. Pocan as amended. Do any other members seek recognition to speak on the amendment as amended? Seeing none, the question is now on the amendment offered by Mr. Pocan. All those in favor say aye. I'm sorry, I missed somebody. Oh, I'm sorry.
Just the final minute. No problem, Mr. Chair. It's late, and you know what?
A little unsettling and unusual procedure, but
Again,
I apologize to my friend.
I don't want to
I
end this way,
recognize my
Mr.
friend
Chair.
to close.
I am glad to withdraw this amendment, and I'm sorry that we had to spend the last 15 minutes doing this much ridiculousness. So if with unanimous consent, I'd be glad to withdraw this amendment.
Amendment is withdrawn. Just as a matter of, we still have to vote on very minor adjustments to the 302Bs. I remind everybody these are just largely because of court rulings on things like contract costing at Indian Hospital, so pretty minor shuffling of the numbers, but we do have to vote on it. So please, when we finish the bill, don't leave. Seeing no further amendments, I now recognize Mr. Rogers for a motion.
Mr. Chair, I move to favorably report the fiscal year 2025 Agriculture, Rural Development, Food and Drug Administration, and related agencies appropriations bill to the House.
The question's now on the motion to favorably report the fiscal year 2025 Agricultural, Rural Development, Food and Drug Administration related agencies appropriations bill to the House. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Recorded vote has been requested. Can I have a show of hands, please?
6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Hands raised.
Okay. Sufficient number of hands having been raised, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Amadei. Mrs. Bice. Mrs. Bice, aye. Mr. Bishop. No. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Calvert. Aye. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carl. Aye. Mr. Carl, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Cartwright. No. Mr. Cartwright, no. Mr. Case. Mr. Case, no. Mr. Siscomani. Yes. Mr. Siscomani, aye. Mr. Klein. Aye. Mr. Klein, aye. Mr. Cloud. Mr. Cloud, aye. Mr. Clyde. Aye. Mr. Clyde, aye. Mr. Cole. Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, no. Mr. Loro. No. Mr. Loro, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Edwards. Aye. Mr. Edwards, aye. Mr. Elzy. Mr. Elzy, aye. Mr. Espaillat. No. Mr. Espaillat, no.
I think the young lady put it very well. Could we have order? Thank you.
Mr. Fleischman. Aye. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Ms. Frankel. Ms. Frankel. Ms. Frankel, no. Mr. Franklin. Mr. Franklin, aye. Mr. Garcia. Mr. Garcia, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Ms. Granger. Mr. Guest. Mr. Guest, aye. Mr. Harder. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, aye. Mrs. Hinson. Mrs. Hinson, aye. Mr. Hoyer. No. Mr. Hoyer, no. Mr. Joyce. Ms. Captor. Ms. Captor, no. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer, no. Mr. LaTurner. Miss Lee of California. Miss Lee of California, no. Miss Lee of Nevada. Miss Lee of Nevada, no. Miss Letlow. Miss Letlow, aye. Miss McCollum. Miss McCollum, no. Miss Ming. Miss Ming, no. Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinar, aye. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, aye. Miss Pingree. Miss Pingree, no. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, no. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, no. Mr. Reschenthaler. Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Ruppersberger. Mr. Ruppersberger, no. Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Rutherford, aye. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, aye. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Trone. Mr. Trone, no. Miss Underwood. Miss Underwood, no. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. No. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, no. Mrs. Watson Coleman. Mrs. Watson Coleman, no. Miss Wexton. Miss Wexton, no. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, aye. Mr. Zinke. Mr. Zinke, aye.
Are there any members who have yet to vote? Mr. Aguilar?
Mr. Aguilar, no.
Are there any other members wishing to vote or change their vote? Not, the clerk will tally. Again, I would ask you, please don't leave. The allocations will be quick and easy, but we do need to do it. On this vote, the ayes are 29, the noes are 26. The motion is agreed to. I asked unanimous consent that staff be permitted to make technical and conforming changes to the bill and the report just approved. Seeing no objection, so ordered. Without objection, so ordered. We'll take 1 minute to pass the 302Bs out, so you have the, already done it? Okay, very good. Our final order of business today is consideration of the report on revised suballocation of budget allocation for fiscal year 2025. I now recognize myself for remarks. I'll be very brief. 2 months ago, the committee marked up a report on interim 302B subcommittee allocation, subsequent events, including a Supreme Court decision and an amendment adopted on the floor, necessitated minor adjustment. Today's report reflects those changes and represents the final 302B suballocations for fiscal year 2025. I urge all members to support these 302 allocations. I would now like to recognize Ranking Member DeLauro for her remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for yielding. Throughout this year's process, what the House Republican majority has shown is that they cannot adhere to their promise of sticking to the caps with nothing more. Let me be perfectly clear. House Republicans have acknowledged in their own bills that the statutory caps are insufficient, and that is something I wholeheartedly agree with. However, despite opening the door to additional resources, House Republicans' proposals still fall woefully short. Their bills would still cut non-defense investments by more than $52 billion from where we were with the final bills in March, leaving more than $60 billion in investments in American families on the table. So I say to House Republicans what I have said time and time again during this process. We know where we need to go. House Democrats are ready to work together, but we will accept nothing less than a 1% increase in defense and non-defense funding. That means a starting point of $786 billion in non-defense resources. To those who believe we need more on the defense side, like the esteemed chair of the Defense Subcommittee testified at Rules last month, I will say again, Democrats will demand that every additional dollar for defense will be matched by a dollar for critical non-defense investments in American families. Cannot support these irresponsible funding levels, and I hope Republicans will reconsider their strategy. Join us at the table to support workers and families, to finish the business of the American people on time. It is time to govern. Thank you, and I yield back.
Are there any other members wishing to make general comments on the report? Seeing none, are there any amendments to the report? Seeing no amendments, I now recognize Mr. Rogers for a motion.
Mr. Chair, I move the committee approve the report on the revised 302B allocations for fiscal year 2025.
Questions now on the motion to favorably report the revised 302B allocations. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Recorded vote has been requested and sufficient number of hands have been raised. The clerk will call. No, the clerks will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Aye. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Amadei. Mrs. Bice. Aye. Mrs. Bice, aye. Mr. Bishop. No. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Calvert. Aye. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carl. Aye. Mr. Carl, aye. Mr. Carter. Aye. Mr. Cartwright. No. Mr. Cartwright, no. Mr. Case. No. Mr. Case, no. Mr. Siscomani. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, aye. Mr. Cloud. Mr. Cloud, aye. Mr. Clyde. Mr. Clyde, aye. Mr. Cole.
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, no. Ms. DeLauro. No. Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards, aye. Mr. Elzey. Mr. Elzey, aye. Mr. Espaillat. Mr. Espaillat, no. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Ms. Frankel. Ms. Frankel, no. Mr. Franklin. Mr. Franklin, aye. Mr. Garcia. Mr. Garcia, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Ms. Granger. Mr. Guest. Mr. Guest, aye. Mr. Harder. Dr. Harris.
Aye.
Dr. Harris, aye. Mrs. Hinson. Mrs. Hinson, aye. Mr. Hoyer.
Congratulations.
Mr. Hoyer, no. Mr. Joyce. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer, no. Mr. LaTurner. Miss Lee of California. Miss Lee of California, no. Miss Lee of Nevada. Miss Lee of Nevada, no. Miss Letlow. Miss Letlow, aye. Miss McCollum. Miss McCollum, no. Miss Ming. Miss Ming, no. Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinar, aye. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, aye. Miss Pingree. Miss Pingree, no. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, no. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, no. Mr. Reschenthaler. Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Ruppersberger. Mr. Ruppersberger. Mr. Ruppersberger, no. Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Rutherford, aye. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, aye. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Trone. Mr. Trone, no. Miss Underwood. Miss Underwood, no. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, aye. Miss Wasserman Schultz. Miss Wasserman Schultz, no. Mrs. Watson Coleman. Miss Watson Coleman, no. Miss Wexton. Miss Wexton, no. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, aye. Mr. Zinke. Mr. Zinke, aye.
Are any members wishing to vote or change their vote?
Mr. Siscomani, aye. Mr. Aguilar, no.
Any other members wishing to vote or change their vote? If not, the clerks will tally. On this vote, the ayes are 29, the noes are 26. The motion is agreed to. I ask unanimous consent the staff be permitted to make technical and conforming changes to the report just approved. Seeing no objection, so ordered. There being, without objection, so ordered. There being no further business, the committee stands adjourned.